and only then would they follow up with a decisive charge by the Mamluks.
Okay, now contrast that terrifying force with what Baldwin IV had managed to scrape together in the fortress city of Ascalon.
It's a shocking contrast. As we mentioned, the total force was probably between 3,000 and 4,500 men. But the irreplaceable core, the knights, that was frighteningly small.
William of Tyre recorded it, right?
He said Baldwin rallied his forces with only 375 knights. Now just think about that for a moment. 375 heavily armored, highly trained, incredibly expensive men against perhaps 26,000 professional soldiers.
But he did have a crucial addition. He had the Templars.
A small but critical number. Around 80 Templar knights, led by their formidable and very aggressive Grand Master, Eustace Animal.
And that concentration of Templars, they must have been absolutely vital. They were, arguably the most professional, disciplined fighting force in the world at that time.
They were the tip of the spear, the absolute elite. The rest of the force, the bulk of the 3,000 or 4,000, were infantry, archers, crossbowmen, spearmen, and a force known as the Turcopoles.
Let's clarify that term, Turcopoles, for the listener. They weren't Frankish knights.
No, not at all. Turcopoles were light cavalry and mounted archers who were recruited locally from the indigenous Christian populations of the Levant. They often served as scouts, skirmishers, and messengers.
So they were essential because they understood the terrain.
They understood the terrain, and they offered the Franks some semblance of the mobility that Saladin's army possessed in spades. But they lacked the heavy armor and, crucially, the shock power of the Frankish knights.
Which means the entire Frankish strategy boiled down to one thing, one desperate gamble.
Pure necessity. It was all about the focused, disciplined, heavy armored cavalry charge. There was zero room for error. They couldn't get into a skirmishing battle. They would be annihilated. They had to break the enemy instantly.
And their doctrine demanded that this charge be perfect.
The shock doctrine, yes. It required the knights to be held in a rigid, tight formation, the conroy, and then launched with maximum momentum all at once. This charge had to penetrate deeply, shatter the enemy's center, and achieve a complete rout before the Ayyubid flanks could close in and use their overwhelming numbers.
So if the charge stalls, if the terrain betrays them, or if the enemy just holds their nerve,
the Frankish force would simply be enveloped and destroyed. It was an all-or-nothing proposition.
Which brings us back to the leadership dynamic, and specifically to Baldwin IV. How do we reconcile this severely afflicted 16-year-old king with a successful battlefield commander?
Well, the sources show a remarkable level of dedication and strategic acumen from him. Baldwin's personal presence, despite his affliction, provided the single most important element: royal legitimacy and inspiration.
He was the king, the only one who could unite these fractious groups.
Exactly. He was the only figure who could get the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the secular nobility like Reynold of Chatillon to fight under one banner.
And as we've discussed, his physical skill, though compromised, was still sufficient to lead from the front.
William of Tyre's comments are explicit. Baldwin remained capable in the saddle. It wasn't just symbolic leadership. It was active command. His youth and his known illness might have suggested weakness to Saladin, leading to that complacency we mentioned, but instead it fueled his own personal resolve and, crucially, the desperate morale of his men.
His military counterpoint in this whole operation was Reynold of Chatillon, a figure so central to this victory, yet so destructive to the kingdom's long-term future.
Reynold is a fascinating, incredibly volatile figure. He had just been released in 1176 after 15 brutal years in a Saracen prison.
So he had a personal score to settle.
A massive one. He was the definition of an uncompromising hawk, deeply experienced in combat but completely disdainful of truces or any kind of diplomacy with Saladin. He acted as Baldwin's second-in-command for this campaign.
Now, I want to probe this point because we often take the Frankish narrative that Baldwin was the strategic mastermind at face value. But Arab sources later on, they suggested Reynold was the true commander at Montgisard. What's the historical consensus on that?
That's where the analysis gets really complex and interesting. Modern historians generally acknowledge that Baldwin, as the king, provided the essential strategic vision, the big decisions.
Like the decision to retreat into Ascalon, the timing of the breakout.
Exactly. Those are the king's calls.
Yeah.
However, Reynold was the combat leader on the ground. He was the aggressive impetus. His long-term burning hatred of Saladin and his sheer ferocity provided the necessary drive for the actual charge.
So why would the Arab chroniclers later on inflate Reynold's role? Why make him out to be the real strategic genius? Wouldn't they want to diminish their greatest enemy?
It's counterintuitive, but it serves a profound political purpose for them. Think about it. If Saladin, the great champion of Islam, is soundly routed by a massive Frankish army led by the notorious, experienced, and feared warrior Reynold of Chatillon, well, that mitigates the humiliation.
Well, it's a more honorable defeat.
It's far less shameful than being utterly routed by a tiny, ill-prepared force commanded by a 16-year-old leper king.
So they made Reynold the mastermind not to praise him, but to lessen the shame of their own catastrophic failure.
Exactly. And, as we'll see when we get to the aftermath, inflating Reynold's cruelty and his influence also served to justify Saladin's later, highly publicized execution of Reynold after the Battle of Hattin. He becomes this useful boogeyman for both sides' political narrative.
A convenient villain.
A very convenient villain. But for Montgisard, the success rested on this mutual dependence. Baldwin's royal authority and strategic vision, coupled with Reynold's aggressive frontline combat leadership. One couldn't have succeeded without the other.
This is where we move from the political crisis to pure tactical brilliance. Saladin's army sweeps into the kingdom, and Baldwin, seeing these impossible numbers, makes the completely counterintuitive decision not to fight, but to retreat.
Yes, on November 22nd, when Saladin's massive army arrived at the gates of Ascalon, Baldwin pulled his tiny force inside the city walls. This was a desperate, high-stakes move.
And he immediately issued an air ban.
He did. And for anyone who isn't familiar with that term, an air ban was essentially a desperate general call to arms. It meant mobilizing every available, able-bodied local man.
So not just knights and professional soldiers.
No, you're talking town levies, local militias, maybe even pilgrims who happened to be in the area and could hold a spear. It really highlights the existential risk they were facing. They were scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel for manpower.
And by retreating into the city, Baldwin was effectively sending a message to Saladin.
He was telling him, we are besieged, we are neutralized, and we are afraid.
And Saladin bought it completely. This is where his greatest flaw, that overconfidence, becomes an operational disaster.
He took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. Saladin's operational complacency at this moment was profound. He believed the Crusader army was bottled up in Ascalon and nearby Gaza, and that they posed no immediate threat to his advance toward the richer centers of the kingdom.
So he saw a psychological victory and just failed to recognize the tactical danger he was creating for himself.
Totally. Instead of laying siege to Ascalon, or even maintaining a tight cordon around the city to keep them pinned down, he let his massive, disciplined army scatter.
Why would he do that? Why break up your greatest advantage, your numbers?
Well, he advanced toward Jerusalem, but crucially, he allowed his host to spread out over a very large operational area. They started moving toward fertile, wealthy cities like Ramla and Lydda. And the reason was twofold: foraging and plunder.
An army of that size needs to eat.
An army of 26,000 men needs a lot of food, and allowing them to forage relieves a massive logistical burden. And secondly, the plunder motivated his troops. But in doing so, he turned them from a cohesive military force into a vast, decentralized mass of looters.
They went from being an army to being a huge, very valuable, but very dispersed caravan.
Precisely. And this is the profound intelligence failure that the sources point to. Saladin neglected to send scouts back to actively monitor the garrison at Ascalon.
He just assumed they would stay put.
The possibility of a breakout simply didn't register. His overconfidence told him the enemy was defeated, demoralized, and just hunkered down, waiting for an inevitable siege.
And that window, the moment the Ayyubid army was most dispersed and least prepared for a real battle, was the exact moment Baldwin and Reynold chose to strike.
The timing had to be absolutely flawless. Inside Ascalon, Baldwin secretly ordered the Templars at Gaza to abandon their post and join him, consolidating every single available professional fighter into one fist. Then, they executed the countermove, a rapid, silent breakout from the city.
And they didn't take the main road. They didn't take the obvious, expected path.
No, they used their tactical advantage of local knowledge. They marched rapidly north along the coast, likely using a parallel path that William of Tyre described as barely known to strangers.
This maximized their stealth.
It maximized stealth and minimized the chance of being detected by any of the scattered Ayyubid foraging parties. This specific tactical choice is often credited to the presence of local lords in Baldwin's army, like the Ibelin brothers, who had intimate, detailed knowledge of all the byroads and the terrain between Ascalon and Ramla.
So they essentially executed a classic flanking maneuver, catching Saladin's dispersed army completely by surprise at a place called Montgisard near Ramla, and the terrain here was their accomplice.
Terrain was everything. There's a very strong theory that the Franks deliberately steered this interception toward a specific geographical area, possibly near the mound of Al-Safia, or Blanchard as the Crusaders called it.
What was so special about this area?
Crucially, this area had stretches of marshy, wet ground.
Which is kryptonite for a highly mobile cavalry army that relies on speed and maneuverability.
It completely paralyzes them. Marshy ground, mud, uneven footing, it neutralizes the Ayyubid numerical advantage. Instead of overwhelming the Franks through fluid maneuvers, Saladin's army was forced to concentrate its strength in limited corridors of dry ground.
Which is exactly where the Frankish shock doctrine could be applied with maximum devastating effect.
Exactly. And the Egyptian chroniclers even point to their own logistical failures compounding the disarray. Sources like Ibn al-Athir noted that the Ayyubid baggage train, which was already spread out, suffered major delays at a muddy river crossing. This just added to the disorganization and distraction.
So Saladin's forces weren't just surprised. They were physically and logistically inhibited at the precise moment the Franks struck.
They were caught while dispersed, marching, and completely unprepared for a pitched battle. It was a commander's worst nightmare.
And now we arrive at the battle itself, November 25th, 1177. Before the heavy cavalry charge, there is that iconic moment, the moment that speaks volumes about the psychological stakes of this battle.
The moment of the true cross. This scene really defines the legend of Baldwin IV. We're told that despite his illness, the king was helped down from his horse, or perhaps lowered from the saddle, to drop to his knees in the mud, right there in front of the relic of the true cross, which was always carried into battle.
And he prays publicly.
He prayed publicly, seeking divine aid for what everyone present knew was essentially a suicide mission.
That is immense. I mean, it's not just a religious act. It's a profound act of leadership. It's psychological warfare for his own troops.
It absolutely galvanized them. The sources say his men rose up, cheering and shouting the battle cry, "The Holy Sepulchre." This single act secured the crucial morale boost they needed to commit to a potentially fatal charge. The entire army, looking at their young, sick king kneeling in the mud before God, found the resolve to commit to this overwhelming act of disciplined violence.
And then came the charge. Heavy armored knights, packed into a tight formation, hitting an unprepared, dispersed enemy line with the force of a battering ram.
The charge was immediate, and it was devastating. Led by the disciplined Templars and Reynold of Chatillon, the Crusader army launched a full frontal attack right at the center of Saladin's lines, which were still hurriedly trying to form up.
They just shattered them.
They shattered the Ayyubid formation instantly. Saladin's forces couldn't deploy their missile power, they couldn't maneuver because of the restricted terrain and the sheer surprise of the attack. They just broke.
And the sources suggest the Frankish forces broke through those lines so deeply that they came close to capturing Saladin himself.
Frighteningly close.